Yeah,
Right.
well, I'll play this clip here. I'll preface saying that, Wesley Clark is no angel, of course. Wesley Clark was a top
Exactly.
U.S. general and NATO commander.
Right.
And while I'm playing this, I'm not necessarily saying that Wesley Clark is some good guy, but it's interesting because it shows that even within the U.S. ruling class, within the elites who run the Pentagon, who run the U.S.
Right.
military,
Somewhat
even they were
outraged.
frustrated. He himself, before I play this clip, Wesley Clark, again, this top U.S. general who oversaw numerous war crimes, he said openly that there was a coup inside the U.S. government waged by these neoconservative, hyper-imperialist figures from the Project for the New American Century, and they recognized that after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, that they had a decade-long period of in which they could establish full spectrum dominance of the world, and the U.S. empire could overthrow all of the former Soviet allies in the Middle East. So here are his comments. They're really remarkable comments, honestly, and the fact that they're not well known shows how effective the propaganda and censorship in the media are. So here's this clip of a speech he gave in 2007 at the Elite Commonwealth Club. He didn't give this like an independent media. This was at an elite event. It's not playing here. Let me reload this. So here's Wesley Clark.
What happened in 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have bipartisan agreement, we didn't have American understanding of it, and we had instead a policy coup in this country. A coup, a policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. I went through the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11. I went back there to see Don Rumsfeld, and he said, I just want to tell you, he said, nobody's going to tell us where or when we can bomb. Nobody. He said, I'm thinking of calling this a floating coalition. And I went downstairs. I was leaving the Pentagon, and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, sir, we're going to attack Iraq. And I said, why? He said, we don't know. He said, I said, well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, no. Well, I walked out of there pretty upset. And then we attacked Afghanistan. And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan.
Quick note, I just want to point out, and I'll play playing this clip because he says some more important things, but look at this list of countries: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Iraq was destroyed by the U.S., overthrown in a war, obviously. Libya still has a failed state 10 years after the 2011 NATO war. Syria has been devastated by a dirty war for 10 years. Lebanon, as we'll talk about, and as Asad mentioned, Lebanon has been devastated by destabilization campaigns, constant U.S. meddling. Somalia has a U.S. failed state thanks to U.S. meddling. Sudan last year had this kind of like color revolution kind of thing and immediately restored relations with Israel and now allows Israel to fly flights over Sudan. And Iran is the only country that is still standing, notwithstanding endless attempts by the U.S. to overthrow its government. So
and today is the anniversary of the Benghazi attacks, I should mention.
Yeah, so it took longer than 5 years. The famous quote is 7 countries in 5 years. It took 20 years, but I mean, they succeeded in almost all of them except Iran. But anyway,
We should also add, Ben, we should also add that all these countries were also bombed many years before by the United States in the 1980s, by Israel and or the United States. Somalia, the US was involved. Libya was bombed by the Reagan administration. Lebanon was bombed in 1982 to 84 by the US Marines who were deployed in Lebanon. Syria was bombed as well. Iraq, as I said, before the sanctions even, there were covert operations, the Israelis and the American over there. And also, I cannot think of one Arab country in which Democrat and Republican administration did not engage in covert or overt operations there.
Exactly. So that's why I was prefacing. I mean, Wesley Clark is a Democrat. He has a vested political interest in kind of exaggerating the internal conflicts between the right-wing, neoconservative Republicans at that
Correct.
time and the Democrats. Although now, of course, Democrats and neocons have basically merged, and like the Hillary Clinton neoconservative Democratic model is basically mainstream. But anyway, I'm just
Right.
going to play. There's just another brief clip here because he says a few important things that I think are important to understand 9/11 and the war on terror.
And Iran. I said, 7 countries in 5 years. I said, is that a classified memo? He said, yes, sir. I was so stunned by this, I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the...
And then here he continues really quickly. He specifically names the Project for the New American Century and their plans to reassert control over what had been Soviet allies.
And I realized then it came back to me. A 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. In 2001, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position.
So just emphasizing this, Wolfowitz was the number 3 position in the Pentagon under George Bush's father, George H.W. Bush.
Pentagon. And I had gone to see him when I was a 1-star general, and he brought me in, and I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm.
Which is, of course, for people who don't know, watching younger people, Desert Storm was the first Iraq war waged by Bush Sr. at the time.
And he said, well, yeah, he said, but not really. He said, because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't. And he said, but one thing we did learn, he said, we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop.
Key point. So
just keep playing it.
Just emphasizing, the Bush administration emphasized, the Bush Senior administration emphasized that we no longer are afraid of the Soviet Union intervening to stop us. There's no longer any competitor. The U.S. empire is hegemonic.
He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes. Syria,
Iran was not a
Iraq,
Soviet ally.
Before
but...
the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. It was a pretty...
So anyway, that's the key quote right there. He said, we have 5 or 10 years to clean up those allies of the Soviet Union. That clean up meaning overthrow all of those governments and install U.S. puppets. And he said, 5 or 10 years before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. And that brings us to today, of course, with Russia reasserting itself in China.
Stunning thing.
And then I'll finish it here.
The purpose of the military is to start wars and change government.
The purpose of the U.S. military is to start wars and change
not
governments.
To sort of deter conflict. We're going to invade countries, and this country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup.
When did the U.S. deter conflicts?
And Cheney.
Exactly.
And Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it
and control it. Absolutely. U.S. control.
It went back to those comments in 1991.
Yeah, the Wolfowitz doctrine. The Wolfowitz doctrine spells that out, and it's also about China. But go ahead, Asad.
But I'm glad that Ben qualified. I'm glad that Ben qualified his remarks, because those remarks, as they play outside of this platform, are often used in order to draw an artificial imaginary line between the Democratic and the Republican Party.
Exactly.
It should be remembered that the Clinton administration really started a very deadly and destructive trend of war and sanctions against the country of Iraq, which became now the model that was emulated everywhere. The sanctions, the tight strangulating sanctions that are being used today in many countries, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Lebanon. Lebanon is also suffering from those kind of sanctions. And we should also mention that the Obama administration is a classic case where the liberal, like Samantha Power and Ben Rhodes, were indistinguishable in their advocacy for war and destruction from the neocons that we all talk about. We should make their names as famous as Bill Kristol and David Frum and the others.